So I'm going to just move on from some of the great, inspiring things that we've been hearing about Gerda Lerner. I also want to start because, as we all know, the personal is political. Gerda Lerner was introduced to me by Uma Chakravarti. So it seems all those years ago in Delhi University in the 90s when I was a master's student. So it seems it is not only a great honor, but it almost feels like a full circle that I'm now sharing a panel and a screen, albeit online, talking about Gerda Lerner. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the relevance of Gerda Lerner in my life, but also trying to reevaluate Lerner's paradigms in the Indian context. Uma's already spoken quite a bit about that, but I'm hoping I'll be able to offer some other insights as well. I am, as Yana introduced me, I am now in the sociology department, but I started off as a historian. I don't know whether the sideways moved towards sociology. I miss history, but history is all amongst us, and you can't be a sociologist if you don't understand the past, as we've been famously reminded time and time again. Paul, do you mind moving us to the next slide, please? Okay, so obviously, some of these things probably just to remind us about where I situate and the ideas. I mean, Gerda Lerner's got so many different ideas, incredible uh, range of ideas that she has created. I'm going to take a few of those ideas and see whether they can work in terms of the Indian um, contemporary socio-political context as well, and a little bit into history because I don't want to lose my historical roots. Of course, the most famous idea that Gerda Lerner exposed us to was that patriarchy is historically constructed. And because it's historically constructed, it is natural, and therefore we could end it or we could aim to end it. Um, Unfortunately, my dream had always been that I could, in my lifetime, see the end of patriarchal worlds. I don't think that's going to happen. I sadly don't think it's going to happen in the lifetime of my daughter and my son either. But there is hope, and the hope is given by the idea that it isn't natural, it isn't innate. And those are the ideas that we need to probably hold on to in these dark times. It's a framework which has been somewhat rooted in Western histories, though I would challenge that. But it is also a really important framework. The other interesting thing, of course, and the important thing that Lerner's ideas are for me is the the sense that again, it's not patriarchy is historically constructed. It can be moved and it can be changed and amended by women, by feminist consciousness. So the idea of feminist consciousness and the idea of the historical construction of patriarchy are the two powerful things for me in terms of Gerda Lerner's legacies, ongoing legacies. And I'm going to look at it in the context of, as I said, the Indian situation. Please, could you move us on to the next slide, please? So her core ideas is, of course, not only that patriarchy has been created, but Gerda Lerner looked at patriarchy or defined, if you like, patriarchy as men's ability and power, if you like, to name, define, and control women and women's sexuality, and then to institutionalize this through law, religion, and the family. So those are the three areas that I'm going to try and look at in the Indian context. Intersectionality is an idea, of course, Kimberly Crenshaw introduced us to it. Um, Another remarkable, influential woman for me as well. But it's when I was reading Gerda Lerner, um, first in the 1990s and then again a few years ago, and then for this presentation, I was most recently struck by what an intersectional approach that she has taken to women's oppression and resistance. It was not only about women and women's lives, but it was how women's lives intersect with race, class, religion. There were other things that she probably didn't talk about, but obviously the door is open for us and we just have to push it a bit. We could talk about other things like sexuality and so on as well, where you could take an intersectional approach. And then, of course, she talked about women's complicity in patriarchy, and that for me is a really powerful thing as well, because we couldn't have a system of patriarchy which has been so resilient and across different contexts, global contexts, different societies. We just simply couldn't have it if some women, if not many women, aren't complicit with it. And one of the key things that I've been very keen to unpack is how do women benefit from patriarchy, as well as, of course, suffer from it. There's a lot about women suffering. And how do we understand that without blaming women, but also not making excuses for them, if you like? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But she also, of course, talks about women's resistance, sometimes using law and religion. For example, she says mysticism is an alternative mode of thought to patriarchal thinking, which is quite interesting as well in the current context where it seems that religion may not always be able to offer a space for resistance, but Gerda Lerner reminds us that it can be both a space for oppression, but also a space for resistance for some women. And then, of course, she also talked about how women had to struggle to form their own feminist consciousness, particularly under patriarchal hegemony. It is impossible to think about feminism without thinking about patriarchy and women's feminist consciousness, either individually or as a group of women, as a collective, was about challenging patriarchal hegemony. One of the things, of course, that she reminded us of was also both that we had to be careful to resist the urge of the cult of the feminist shiro, if you like, but also to talk about the importance of recognizing the incredible struggles that women had done, individual women had done, and the way that they had actually worked to challenge patriarchy, not only as individuals but sometimes as collectives of women as well. Um, could you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, I'm going to be talking about intersectionality. Um, If you know me a little, you will know that I am obsessed with intersectionality. I'm obsessed by the way in which, because I like complications, I like the way that people's lives are not, of course, made up of one particular identity or one particular experience. It kind of works in this really complicated way. I tried to come up with an image of an Indian intersection, but all I could come up were lots and lots of auto rickshaws and lots of people, and it didn't seem to fit in, but here's what it is. This apparently, according to an image search that I did, is an Indian intersection. I'm not sure it is, but let's pretend it is for the purpose of this presentation. So Gerda Lerner talks about class, and of course she talks about class and gender. She talks about the subordination of women in Western civilization, predating private property and class stratifications. So she talked about how class, subordination of women was almost survived in different forms of social stratification, but um, the private property and class stratification then complicated that particular relationship. We've heard quite a lot about race, but she also talked about the development of societies, the use of class intersecting with race, dictating which women were granted privileges and which were relegated to enslavement, exploitation, and forced labor. And we see that globally now, the role of race, the role of class, the trafficking of women across global borders, and just the kind of intersection of these two or three categories. And then she looked at religion. She recognized how many women were both subordinated by religion, but also some repurposed religion as a feminist space by reinterpreting scriptures, for instance. And of course, I'm thinking about, the role of global networks like Women Living Under Muslim Law. I'm thinking about women who have interpreted different forms of religious texts and tried to repurpose them to see whether they could find a feminist space within them, carving out women led worship spaces and intertwining spirituality with social justice. I think there was a degree of skepticism around the ability to use religion in this way or to find a space within religion in this way. But she nevertheless explored how women were used it. And I think there's also a sense of that was a space which was available for women where they were allowed to be themselves and they could then navigate that space within that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to do briefly, if that's okay, is talk a little bit now about the control of women's sexuality through law um, in the Indian context. Um, so in 2018, this is kind of 8 years ago, if you like, less than 8 years ago, probably depending on the date. Until then, in India, the law dictated that a married woman could not be punished under the adultery law. Um, it was the man who was considered to be a seducer. So any man until 2018 who had sex with a married woman without the permission of her husband had committed a crime, and he could be sent to prison for a maximum of 5 years, made to pay a fine or both. So it's not until very long ago and not not without the role of feminist interventions that adultery laws have been changed in India. On the face of it, it seems that women are under the previous adultery law, if you like. It seems that women have been given are let off. They can have relationships outside marriage and they're not going to be punished for it. But what you're actually seeing is a complete lack of agency here. It also did not allow women to file a complaint against their husband who might be conducting adultery. So that's one example. Another example, of course, and as Uma and other colleagues in India know, there are several examples of the control of women's sexuality through law. I could be here from now until dinner time if you like talking just to this slide, but I'm not going to do that. Um, Another example, of course, is the ongoing debate around marital rape. India is one of the countries in the world, and I can't remember how many there are, but there are unfortunately quite a few, where women are still seen legally as the property of their husbands, and marital rape is still not legally recognized as a criminal offense in India. In the country that I now live in, the United Kingdom, that is something that only happened in the 90s. So in my lifetime, I was already an adult then. Section 63 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, which replaced the Indian Penal Code, which we've had since in India since the Indian Penal Code, since the colonial era, so before 1947, retains the legal exception that sexual intercourse or acts of a man with his own wife, if she's over 18 years of age, does not constitute rape. So again, you have a situation where, in spite of both legal but other challenges that have been made, and feminist challenges which have been made to uh, for to this law, that marital rape continues to be not criminalized. And there's a lot of social opposition to the idea of the criminalization of marital rape. Um, it is seen almost as a sort of last bastion, if you like, of patriarchy, if you to some extent. Could we move on, please, to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So we have talked about how religion might be a safe space for women. It might be a space where women are able to to be able to carve out their own space. However, we also need to look at, in the Indian context, the control of women through religion. Um, so there is again access to sacred spaces. Women face barriers entering major shrines, particularly Hindu shrines and places of worship. So there is this sort of very famous Sabarmati temple dispute, again 2018, which is obviously a remarkable year for many things to do with women's rights. Women were not allowed to enter the Sabarmati uh, temple. It had to do with ideas of women, women of reproductive age, the ideas around purity and pollution, the idea that the women were uh, on their period, or if they were, men soon after childbirth, that they would be polluting the sacred space, if you like. And it was then when there was a sort of campaign again by women who entered the sacred space, caused a lot of challenge, caused a lot of upset in the Indian social structure. Religious leaders were up in arms. However, the challenge was there. It was also challenged legally through the Sabarmati temple dispute. Um, More informally, if you like, there are, of course, there's exclusion from leadership. So, formal religious leadership, priesthoods, and decision making within temples, within sacred spaces across different religions in India remain predominantly gate kept by men, if you like. So you've got, of course, you've got the caste panchayats where you cases of women's particularly to do with women's misdemeanors, if you like, sort of women having relationships outside the family, women having relationships with people from different caste. All those things are predominantly uh, governed by caste panchayats, which are made by men as well. There have again been some points at which women have tried to come together to um, uh, to sort of challenge this. So there have been women's panchayats, if you like, in so an organization that I used to work with in the 1980s came up with the idea of women's panchayats or uh, women's agency, women's groups that actually try to talk a group of sort of grassroots feminism feminists who came together to take up cases of uh, domestic abuse, women being accused of different, uh, uh, again, different crimes, which, we may not be seeing as crimes or having relationships and so on, and then trying to formalize those through a kind of women's arbitration. These are not formal organizations and they don't have a legal status, but nevertheless, there is an element of women trying to take up and create their own spaces, if you like. And of course, there's the control of religion, women through religion and religious laws. There are deep-rooted religious and customary biases in a variety of customary laws, but also in different religious laws in India, which favor men and restrict equal distribution of law and property. There are again a number of examples I could give here, but to just to kind of summarize, most of the religious laws in India um, tend to discriminate against women in the area of inheritance. And if that doesn't happen legally, then that can happen within the family as well. So even where women might have equal inheritance in the eyes of the law, within familial systems, they are not allowed to have that. And that is again something that is legitimized through religion. And of course, concepts like love jihad, the idea that uh, uh, women and men have falling in love across different caste groups, across different religions, are wrong, and the particularly in the context of Hindu Muslim relationships. So and these are concepts which have been weaponized by community patriarchs to monitor and restrict uh, women's personal choices regarding love and marriage. Arguably, they restrict men's personal choices regarding love and marriage as well. But women often, and unremarkably sometimes, I guess, pay the price for showing agency in a way that is almost has much more violent repercussions on their lives than men do. Um, And we can also see that, for instance, in the context of South Asian communities in the UK and across Europe, where forced marriage, ideas of forced marriage impact on both men and women. So both men and women could be forced into marriage, but women who are forced into marriage tend to experience violence and abuse on a different scale than men do in this context. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about institutional failures. Um, One of the key things to think about, of course, is that gendered expectations within marriage are upheld in law. There have been some recent judgments which have been incredibly heartening. Even in these dark times, we have some hope. Sometimes we've got judgments which have said that women, there was a recent judgment in India about a divorce petition from a man who said that his wife didn't cook for him and didn't do household chores. And the judge said that that was not an example of mental cruelty. Women could literally do what they wanted. And those kinds of things are being challenged, but they are still there. For one judge who might be able to speak out on behalf of women and women's rights, there would be 10 other judgments which would reinforce those kind of gendered expectations within marriage. And of course, they reinforce the societal expectations that are there and the societal norms that are there. We all know that legal systems have failed survivors. This isn't unique to India. We can see that on a global basis. Survivors of violence and abuse of different forms, whether it's domestic abuse, or sexual abuse, tend to fail survivors on the whole. Conviction rates for domestic abuse and sexual abuse are very low globally, in countries like the UK and other countries across Europe, but also in India as well. There is also a rhetoric in India about how women are taking advantage of domestic abuse laws by prosecuting their parents-in-law and then prosecuting their husbands in false cases of domestic abuse. So there is a narrative of women misusing the law, which again speaks to my mind the kind of deep-seated insecurity that patriarchy is now showing every time there's a challenge there. So women are then accused of going too far, if you like. Women have also been, there are cases of sexual harassment. There's a lot of positive areas of development. So there are sexual harassment in the workplace laws in India. There are sexual harassment committees set up in different workplaces, again, due to the kind of legal feminist approaches and activism shown by women's movement across the years since the 80s or even before that. However, women have also suggested that the due process can sometimes cause further trauma. So there is the work of colleagues such as Pratiksha Bakshi, who talks about how legal processes in the case of, in her example, around the case of sexual abuse, and the court processes cause further trauma for women who may have experienced sexual abuse. Sorry, just 1 minute.
Do you reckon you could get me and Grace an Uber to
Just, just do that. Just do it from my phone. So sorry. That was just my daughter had come in for something.
Geetanjali, just a short reminder, you have been speaking for about 30 minutes. So
have I?
you should,
Really?
yeah, so you should also have time to conclude. Yeah.
I will conclude really quickly now, and I must apologize. The the personal always comes in. Okay. To come back, due process creates further trauma sometimes, and that can lead to forms of activism. We can be critical about some of these forms of activism. So, for instance, the ideas around online feminism, for instance, the Me Too movement, and the way, the critiques around how women posting Me Too and naming people without due process isn't actually isn't speaking to legal processes, if you like, but that it also comes from a deep-seated distrust to legal systems, if you like. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, I'm going to whiz through the next couple of slides. Um, there is the caste and class gender axis that withholds, we've talked a little bit about that. Um, Women, 10 to 11 Dalit women are raped every day across India, and the majority of these are working class women. So, sexual violence is often used to reinforce caste dominance, though perpetrators can also be from within the same caste and class group. Can I have the next slide, please? I think what I'd like to end with, because I do like to end with hope, is looking at intersectionality within feminism and feminist responses. So this is a little bit of a critique, if you like. I'm not going to read out the quotation here, but one of the things which have been asked of Indian feminist movements is, why is it that certain kinds of cases become more popular, or become a kind of peg to hold to for feminists to rally around rather than other cases? Why is it, for instance, that minority cases of sexual abuse and violence against minority women are not often treated in the same way uh, as the cases of middle class women? So what happens when certain women, why are certain women seen as being more perfect a victim than another? What does that tell us about the intersectionality of feminist responses? Though what is, to me, what is heartening within this debate is that the critique around the responses also comes from within the feminist movement because of the vibrancy of the movement. Can we move on, please? So I did talk about women's complicity. I'm not going to go into a lot of debate, a lot of discussion around that. But of course, just to give you an example, of course, the role of el older women within the family, mothers and mothers-in-law perpetuating control and abuse on younger women in the family. And of course, Denise Candiotti's idea of patriarchal bargains and the advantage or the benefits that that has for women, and how women use those patriarchal bargains to increase their agency within hierarchies that they can't always challenge. Can I have the next slide, please? So, the question that I want to end with is that there are many women, there are many women's voices. How do we listen to women when they speak? I think it is wrong for us, and of course, we know that from Gerda Lerner's work. We can't pretend that women don't speak. Women do speak, but most of the time when they speak, they're not heard. So, how do we give women the power back so that their experiences are not dismissed? And how do we credit women voices with the different kinds of voices? How do we credit the women of the voices of all women, including marginalized women, with the same importance as as the voices of some women who might be seen as benefiting from patriarchy. Could we move on, please? So I think, in the sense, what I've tried to do is rethink Gerda Lerner and to recognize diverse feminist resistance, to look at how intersectionality has been a running theme through Gerda Lerner's analysis, and that is something I believe can be helpful in when we are looking at Indian society. And then the last slide, please. Okay, so for me, I think just wanted to end as well is that I think it is indeed possible to look at India and reevaluate it, and to look at the different forms of patriarchy, look at the different forms of ideology, legal, cultural, familial ideologies that reinforce patriarchy, which have been reinforced by colonialism and modernity and post colonialism as well. But then also look at how we can challenge them and how we can begin to unpack that through feminist resistance, if you like. And I think that's me done now. I don't know if I've gone over time, and if I have, I do apologize, but I think I've finished now. Thank you.